McKinney, Texas. Spring morning, 1855. The main street runs exactly 440 yards from the courthouse to the livery stable at the far end of town. On this particular day, that distance has become the most contested piece of ground in the Republic. Court has adjourned. Every hotel within 20 miles has turned away men to make room for women and children. The crowd, numbers in the hundreds, maybe 1,000, pressed shoulder to shoulder along both sides of the dirt road. Money changes hands in amounts that could buy a plantation, debts scrawled on scraps of paper, land deeds folded into coat pockets as collateral. 2 horses stand at the starting line. Monmouth, the local champion, has never lost a race on this stretch. His owner has already spent the purse in his mind. The challenger is a blood-bay stallion named Steel Dust, just over 16 hands, brought up from Lancaster. His jockey sits bareback, the horse's coat sticky with molasses to help him stay mounted. The air smells of dust and sweat and the particular electricity that comes before violence or money changes ownership on a scale that will reshape the social order. Someone fires a pistol, the horses explode forward. In the space of 21, maybe 22 seconds, everything changes. The distance between the starting line and the finish cannot be walked off casually. 440 yards, 1/4 of a mile. The length varies in telling, but the principle remains constant across every colonial village street, every ranch clearing, every improvised track carved into the Texas prairie. This was the crucible distance, the sprinting ground, the measure by which a horse either earned its keep or got sold to pull a plow. Speed over this span determined wealth, settled disputes, established bloodlines that would echo through a century. The horses that could cover that ground fastest were not thoroughbreds bred for distance on manicured English turf. They were something else, something distinctly American, forged in the necessity of frontier survival and the peculiar alchemy that happens when cultures collide and their livestock interbreed. The question of which horses were fastest in the American West cannot be answered with a single name or breed. But it can be answered with precision if we attend to the evidence, follow the bloodlines, and reconstruct the selective pressures that created sprinting machines capable of reaching 44 miles per hour from a standing start. This is a story about 3 types of horses that dominated the speed landscape of the 19th century American frontier. The American quarter horse, refined from colonial stock and Spanish barbs, engineered by generation after generation for explosive acceleration. The Mustang, descendant of Spanish conquistador herds, free-roaming and feral, possessed of endurance that could outlast any domesticated animal. The Appaloosa, selectively bred by the Nez Perce people with a sophistication that rivaled any European breeding program, chosen for intelligence and stamina and a kind of functional beauty that served the demands of mountain warfare. Each of these breeds represented a different solution to the problem of speed in the West. Each carried genetic advantages refined over decades or centuries. Each left an indelible mark on the culture and economy of westward expansion. The speed these horses achieved was not metaphorical. It was measurable, documented in race records and army reports and the careful breeding logs of ranchers who understood that a fast horse could mean the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy, between survival and death. The mythology of the Wild West tends toward exaggeration, but the horses were genuinely exceptional. They had to be. The distances were vast, the terrain brutal, the demands placed on working animals extreme beyond modern comprehension. A cowboy on a cattle drive needed multiple horses in his string because no single animal could sustain the work. The horses that could sprint to head off a breaking stair, navigate rocky arroyos without stumbling, carry a rider 70 miles in a day and do it again tomorrow. Those horses commanded premium prices. Speed was the visible tip of a larger constellation of traits. But speed was what got tested first, what got bragged about, what got bet on. This script examines the documented evidence for which horses were fastest, how they got that way, what purposes that speed served, and why these animals matter to understanding the actual mechanics of frontier expansion rather than its romanticized legend. We will move chronologically from colonial origins through the Civil War era to the final violent confrontations between indigenous peoples and the federal government. We will attend to specific dates, specific animals, specific bloodlines. We will note where the evidence runs thin and where it stands solid. By the end, the picture that emerges is of a landscape where speed was currency and horses were the most valuable technology available to anyone trying to survive or profit in a rapidly transforming continent. The story begins not in Texas, but on the eastern seaboard of colonial North America, where English settlers arrived in the early 1600s bringing with them draft horses suited for farm work. These animals were sturdy, reliable, built for pulling plows and wagons. They were not fast. The settlers encountered something unexpected when they began trading with indigenous tribes. The Cherokee and Chickasaw peoples had horses of Spanish origin, descended from animals brought to Florida and the Southwest by Spanish explorers and missionaries beginning in the 1500s. These were barb horses, compact and quick, with Arabian and Andalusian bloodlines stretching back to North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The horses had come to North America as part of the colonization apparatus, but they had taken on lives of their own. Some escaped. Some were traded. Some were stolen. By 1611, there is documented evidence of English colonists crossing their draft stock with these Spanish-descended horses obtained from the Chickasaw. The offspring showed a peculiar combination of traits. The strength and temperament of the English horses merged with the speed and agility of the Spanish stock. The result was a compact, heavily muscled animal with explosive power in its hindquarters and a disposition that made it manageable. These early crossbred horses found their purpose quickly. Colonial settlements had streets. Those streets ran in straight lines. The colonists, being English, liked to race, but laying out a full oval track required land and labor that most settlements could not spare. The solution was simpler. Run the races down the main street, the standard length of a colonial village street, at least in Virginia and the Carolinas, was 440 yards, exactly 1/4 of a mile. The races that developed around this distance were informal at first, match races between two owners, wagers made on the spot, the whole affair over in less than 30 seconds. But the competition refined the breeding. Horses that won got bred. Horses that lost got sold for farm work or traded away. By the middle of the 1700s, a distinct type had emerged. Colonists called them quarter-pathers or quarter-milers. Later, the celebrated American quarter-of-a-mile running horse. They were not yet a registered breed. No formal stud books existed, but they were recognizable. Short, muscular, built for acceleration rather than sustained speed, temperamentally suited to the chaos of a sprint race where any hesitation meant losing. In 1752, a Virginia horseman named John Randolph imported a stallion from England. The horse was called Janus, a grandson of the Godolphin Arabian, one of the 3 foundation sires of the thoroughbred line. Janus was foaled in 1746 and arrived in colonial Virginia in 1756. When Janus was bred to the colonial mares carrying Chickasaw blood, something crystallized. The offspring inherited compactness, strength, and power from both sides of the pedigree. Janus did not found the quarter horse breed, but he shaped it. His genetic influence appears in nearly every significant bloodline that followed. The traits associated with Janus' progeny became the template: heavily muscled, small ears, broad jaw, a build that suggested barely contained force, the ability to reach top speed within a few strides. By the late 1700s, these horses had a reputation. They could beat thoroughbreds at the quarter mile. They could not beat thoroughbreds at longer distances, but that was not the point. The point was acceleration, the explosive burst from standstill to full gallop, the capacity to cover a specific distance faster than anything else on four legs. Meanwhile, in the Ohio River Valley and points west, another equine population was expanding. The Spanish had brought horses to the Americas, beginning with Hernán Cortés in 1519. One of those horses was reported to be a sorrel with white spots on its belly. The Spanish colonial apparatus spread horses throughout what would become the southwestern United States and Mexico. Some were used in missions, some were used by soldiers, many escaped or were released. By the early 1700s, the western plains were populated with feral herds, descendants of these Spanish imports. These were the Mustangs. Free-roaming, far-ranging, shaped by natural selection rather than human breeding programs. They were smaller than the colonial quarter horses, typically 14 to 15 hands high, weighing around 800 pounds. But they had something else. Endurance, sure-footedness, the ability to survive on sparse prairie grass and limited water, the capacity to cover enormous distances day after day without breaking down. Indigenous tribes on the plains, including the Comanche, Sioux, and Nez Perce, quickly recognized the value of these animals and developed their own horse cultures around them. The Comanche became such skilled horsemen that they were considered the finest light cavalry in the world by military observers. Their horses were Mustangs, caught wild and broken, selected for traits that mattered in warfare and hunting, speed and stamina, and a kind of intelligent responsiveness to the rider. The third piece of the puzzle was developing in the Pacific Northwest. The Nez Perce, or Nimiipuu as they called themselves, acquired their first horses from the Shoshone around 1730. Unlike most other tribes, the Nez Perce did not simply catch and ride whatever horses were available. They implemented selective breeding programs. Males deemed unsuitable were gelded. Inferior animals were traded away. By the mid-1700s, the Nez Perce had breeding troops and a reputation among both Native Americans and European explorers for producing exceptionally high-quality horses. When Lewis and Clark spent 114 days with the Nez Perce during the winter of 1805 to 1806, Meriwether Lewis wrote in his journal on February 15, 1806, that the Nez Perce horses appeared to be of an excellent race, lofty, elegantly formed, active, and durable. He noted specifically that some of these horses were pied with large spots of white irregularly scattered. These were early Appaloosas, named later for the Palouse River that ran through Nez Perce territory. The spotted coat was striking, but it was secondary to function. The Nez Perce selected for intelligence, sure-footedness, and the ability to negotiate treacherous mountain trails from winter quarters in the Wallowa Valley through the Bitterroot Mountains to summer encampments on the plains. Speed was necessary. Endurance was essential. The Appaloosas the Nez Perce developed combined, both traits in a package refined by decades of careful selection. By the early 1800s, these three types represented the fastest horses available west of the Appalachian Mountains. The quarter horse, engineered for sprint racing and cattle work. The Mustang, feral and hardy, capable of covering vast distances. The Appaloosa, specifically bred by indigenous horsemen with standards as rigorous as any European program. Each had distinct characteristics, each served different purposes. But all three shared a common thread. They were products of the American environment, shaped by the demands of frontier life, faster in their respective domains than anything imported from Europe. The question was not which single breed was fastest. The question was fastest at what? Over what distance? Under what conditions? The answers to those questions determined which horses thrived and which bloodlines endured. The American quarter horse in its recognizable form crystallized in the decades before the Civil War. The genetic foundation had been laid in the colonial period, but it was in Texas and the broader Southwest that the animal found its true purpose and identity. The transformation of the quarter horse from sprint racer to indispensable ranch animal happened because of specific pressures and specific individuals. Consider steel dust. Foaled in Kentucky in 1843, sired by a thoroughbred mare, descended from Sir Archie, one of the most influential stallions of the early 19th century. Sir Archie was foaled in 1805, sired by the imported English horse Diomed. Both Steel Dust and another legendary stallion named Shiloh traced their lineage back to Sir Archie, making them genetic cousins in the great experiment of American horse breeding. Steel Dust was purchased as a colt by two brothers-in-law, Middleton Perry and Jones Green, for $300. They brought the yearling with them when they emigrated to the Republic of Texas in 1844. Perry and Green homesteaded near present-day Lancaster, southeast of what would become Dallas. They put Steel Dust to work as a saddle and workhorse, but they also discovered he could win races. The mechanics of quarter-mile racing in mid-19th century Texas were brutal and direct. No fancy tracks, just a straight stretch of road or a cleared field. Horses ran bareback to save weight. Jockeys sometimes coated the horse's back with molasses to improve their grip. Bets were placed in cash, land, livestock, anything of value. The races were over so quickly that a single false start could decide everything. Steel Dust excelled at this. His acceleration was legendary. In the space of a few strides, he went from standing still to full gallop, and once at full speed, nothing could catch him over 440 yards. His reputation spread. He outran every challenger brought to 10 Mile Creek, the farm track owned by Thomas McKee Ellis, Steel Dust's owner's father-in-law. The races became events. People traveled for days to watch. Steel Dust's name became synonymous with a type. Other horses with similar characteristics, heavily muscled sprinters, started being called Steel Dusts generically, the way people might say Kleenex for tissue or Xerox for photocopy. The race in McKinney in 1855 was the pinnacle. Monmouth was the local favorite, undefeated on that particular stretch. The whole town turned out. Court adjourned for the day. Hotels cleared out male guests to accommodate the families coming to watch. The crowd was estimated at close to 1,000 people. Steel Dust won decisively. Soon afterward, he defeated another horse named Brown Dick from Hopkins County. Then came the race against Shiloh, a stallion brought up from Tennessee. This one ended badly. At the starting gate, Steel Dust reared and plunged. He shattered a board, driving a long wooden shard into his shoulder. The injury was severe. He never raced again. The damage left him nearly blind. He spent the rest of his life at stud on Perry's farm, dying sometime between 1864 and 1874. But even blinded and crippled, Steel Dust's genetic legacy spread across Texas and beyond. His offspring inherited his speed, his temperament, his compact build. Cowboys on cattle drives rode horses with Steel Dust blood. Ranchers sought out breeding stock descended from him. The famed King Ranch in South Texas began using Steel Dust and Shiloh bloodlines in 1916, producing horses that won honors at the State Fair of Texas and supplied animals for circuses, rodeos, and polo teams. The economic logic of the quarter horse in the mid-1800s was straightforward. A fast horse could win money on race day. The same horse could work cattle during the week. The traits that made a horse good at sprinting, the quick reflexes, the explosive power in the hindquarters, the ability to change direction suddenly. These were exactly the traits needed for cutting a cow out of a herd or roping a calf. The term cow sense entered the vocabulary. Some horses seemed to instinctively understand what cattle were going to do before they did it. They could anticipate a steer's movements, position themselves correctly, respond without waiting for the rider's command. This was not magic. It was selective breeding for a specific kind of intelligence and responsiveness. Horses that had it were worth more. Horses that did not got traded away. The range cattle industry began developing in earnest after the Civil War ended in 1865. Wild cattle roamed the brush country of South Texas, descended from Spanish longhorns. These animals were gathered into herds and driven north to railheads in Kansas, where they could be shipped east to feed the growing populations of industrial cities. The drives were brutal. Months on the trail covering upwards of 1,000 miles, through terrain that ranged from desert to swollen rivers to open plains where a storm could scatter the herd in minutes. A cowboy needed multiple horses in his remuda, his string of working animals, because no single horse could sustain the work day after day. But the best horses, the ones with steel dust blood or similar breeding, those animals were prized above everything else a man owned, except maybe his saddle. Shiloh arrived in Texas around 1849, 5 years after Steel Dust. His son Billy, out of a daughter of Steel Dust, became what breeders called the fountainhead of Texas quarter horses. The crossing of these bloodlines, Steel Dust and Shiloh, produced animals that combined the best traits of both. The pedigrees were tracked not in formal stud books, because none existed yet, but in the memories of ranchers and in informal records kept on scraps of paper and ledger books. Everyone who mattered in the horse business knew which stallion had sired which mare's foals. Reputation was everything. A horse with proven steel, dust blood could command prices that bought land. The ranges filled with these animals. Major Texas cattle ranches recognized their value. The King Ranch, the 4 Sixes Ranch, often written as 6-6-6-6, the Wagoner Ranch. These operations, some running tens of thousands of acres, became centers of quarter-horse breeding. They brought in foundation stallions, managed breeding programs, kept records. Dan Wagoner set up in the cattle business in 1849. His son, William Thomas Wagoner, built the ranch into an operation covering more than 500,000 acres, running 10,000 mother cows. They sought out the best horses available, bringing in stallions named Yellow Jacket, Yellow Wolf, Midnight, Blackburn, Pretty Boy. These were not random names. These were specific animals with documented bloodlines, chosen for traits that made them useful in the practical work of running a ranch the size of a small nation. The Western expansion created an enormous demand for horses generally, but it created a specific demand for horses that were fast, tough, and tractable. The quarter horse fit that profile exactly. Settlers moving west needed animals that could pull wagons, plow fields, and be ridden when necessary. Gold miners in California needed pack animals and mounts. The military needed cavalry horses. Freight companies needed animals that could haul goods between settlements. The market was vast and growing. Mustangs filled part of that market. They were available in large numbers, free for the taking if you could catch them. Population estimates vary wildly because no comprehensive census was conducted until the Wild and Free-Roaming Horses and Burroughs Act of 1971. But sources agree that millions of Mustangs roamed the West in the 19th century. Some estimates put the peak population in the late 1700s or early 1800s at between 2 and 5 million. By 1848, at the end of the I.C. Mexican-American War, historian J. Frank Dobie estimated around 1 million in Texas alone and perhaps another 1 million scattered across the remainder of the West. Wild horses were concentrated in areas with good grazing, particularly west-central Texas, between the Rio Grande and Palo Duro Canyon. An early 1900 source stated that region had the most concentrated population of feral horses in the Americas. The process of catching and breaking Mustangs became its own industry. Cowboys called Mustangers or Mestañeros, the latter term borrowed from Spanish, would spend weeks tracking and capturing wild herds. The horses were brought to market and sold. Prices were low compared to bred stock, but the volume was high. Mustangs were hardy. They could survive on sparse grass and limited water. They had endurance that exceeded domesticated horses bred in more forgiving environments. A Mustang could cover 40, 50, 60 miles in a day and do it again tomorrow. They were smaller than quarter horses, usually 14 to 15 hands, but they were nimble and sure-footed. For settlers crossing unknown territory, a Mustang was often the better choice than a larger horse that required more feed and care. The genetic diversity of Mustang herds was enormous because they drew from multiple bloodlines. Spanish barbs primarily, but also escaped or released domesticated horses that mixed back into the feral population. This diversity meant that herds in different regions developed distinct characteristics. Some were better suited to desert conditions. Some thrived in mountainous terrain. All of them were fast enough to avoid predators and cover the distances necessary to find food and water in harsh environments. Speed in Mustangs was different from speed in quarter horses. A quarter horse could accelerate faster and reach a higher top speed over short distances, perhaps 44 miles per hour. A Mustang topped out somewhere between 35 and 50 miles per hour, depending on the individual animal, but could maintain a strong pace for hours. The difference mattered enormously depending on what you needed the horse to do. If you were roping cattle, you wanted the explosive sprint of a quarter horse. If you were crossing 200 miles of open range, you wanted the endurance of a Mustang. Many working cowboys had both in their string. The two types served complementary purposes. When ranchers crossed quarter-horse stallions with Mustang mares, the resulting offspring often combined favorable traits from both parents. The hybrid vigor produced animals that had the cow sense and acceleration of the quarter horse, with the stamina and hardiness of the Mustang. These crossbred horses became the workhorses of the cattle drives and the open range era. They were not pedigreed. They were not registered anywhere. But they were the animals doing the actual work of moving millions of cattle from Texas to Kansas between 1867 and 1890. The Appaloosa occupied a different ecological and cultural niche. While quarter horses were being refined by Anglo ranchers in Texas and Mustangs were multiplying across the open range, the Nez Perce in the Pacific Northwest were conducting their own breeding program with standards that equaled or exceeded anything happening elsewhere. The Nez Perce lived in territory that included parts of present-day eastern Washington, Oregon, and western Idaho, an area with abundant grassland suitable for horses. After acquiring their first horses from the Shoshone around 1730, the tribe recognized immediately that selective breeding could produce animals superior to those caught wild or acquired through trade. They gelded inferior males. They traded away horses that did not meet their standards. They kept meticulous track of which stallions produced the best offspring. By the mid-1700s, Nez Perce horses were famous. Neighboring tribes wanted them. European fur traders commented on their quality. The journals of Lewis and Clark documented their excellence in language that was striking, given how little most explorers praised Indian horses. Lewis wrote that they were lofty, elegantly formed, active and durable, some pied with large spots of white scattered among the darker coat colors. The Nez Perce required their horses to perform in conditions that tested every physical capacity. The tribe spent winters in the Wallowa Valley in Oregon, where the elevation was lower and feed more available. In summer, they traveled through the Rocky Mountains to hunting grounds on the plains. This required crossing steep mountain passes, navigating trails that were barely passable, enduring temperature extremes, covering distances that would break lesser animals. The horses that succeeded in this environment were the ones that got bred. The ones that failed were culled from the breeding pool. Over decades, this pressure refined the bloodline. Appaloosas developed traits specific to the demands placed on them. Intelligence, so they could pick their way through rock fields without injuring themselves. Sure-footedness, so they did not stumble on steep slopes. Endurance, so they could carry riders and packs for days without breaking down. And speed, because the Nez Perce used these horses in warfare and hunting buffalo, both of which required rapid bursts of acceleration and sustained galloping. The spotted coat that became the defining visual characteristic of the Appaloosa was not just decorative. The pattern, called leopard spotting or blanket, made the horses easy to identify from a distance. In a herd of hundreds, a rider could pick out his own mount quickly. The mottled skin, visible especially around the muzzle and eyes, and the striped hooves were genetic markers associated with the spotting pattern. The white sclera that gave the eyes an almost human appearance was another trait that breeders noticed and selected for, not because it was aesthetically pleasing, but because it seemed to correlate with other desirable characteristics. By the 1860s, the Nez Perce had what amounted to a distinct breed. They did not call it the Appaloosa. That name came later from white settlers who slurred a Palouse horse into Appaloose and then Appaloosa. But the horses were recognizable and sought after. An early 1860s text described them as elegant chargers, fit to mount a prince. The Nez Perce had managed to create through selective breeding what European horsemen had spent centuries developing with thoroughbreds, a standardized type with predictable traits that bred true generation after generation. The economic value of these horses to the Nez Perce cannot be overstated. Selling horses became a major source of income for the tribe. As more white settlers moved into the region, demand increased. The Nez Perce were willing to trade, and their horses commanded premium prices. The tribe's wealth in horses was immense. Population estimates vary, but reports from the 1870s suggest the Nez Perce collectively owned thousands of animals, with individual families controlling herds numbering in the hundreds. This wealth was mobile. It could not be taken easily. It represented both transportation and trade goods and military power. A tribe with good horses had strategic advantages over enemies and leverage in negotiations with other tribes and with white authorities. The Nez Perce understood this completely. They guarded their breeding stock carefully and made strategic decisions about which animals to trade and which to keep. The result was a horse population that by the middle of the 19th century represented one of the most successful indigenous breeding programs in North American history. The three types, quarter horse, Mustang, and Appaloosa, coexisted across the West in the decades leading up to 1877. Each served specific functions. Each had distinct advantages. The question of which was fastest cannot be answered simply because speed itself is not simple. Acceleration over a quarter mile is different from top speed reached and maintained. A horse that can hit 44 miles per hour from a standing start in 6 strides is faster than a horse that takes 12 strides to reach 40 miles per hour, even if the second horse can maintain that speed longer. The quarter horse dominated in sprint racing because the breed had been engineered specifically for that purpose across 2 centuries. The Mustang dominated in endurance because feral herds had been winnowed by natural selection. The slow and weak died and did not reproduce. The Appaloosa represented a middle ground, fast enough for warfare, durable enough for mountain travel, intelligent enough to be trained for complex tasks. All 3 types were faster than European horses brought west by settlers, which is why those imported breeds largely disappeared from working ranch. Use within a generation. The American environment demanded American horses. The fastest horses were those that had adapted to American conditions, either through deliberate breeding or through the brutal efficiency of natural selection in harsh landscapes. The pace of development accelerated after the Civil War. Texas ranches expanded, cattle drives became industrial in scale. The Transcontinental Railroad opened new markets. The federal government pushed westward expansion aggressively, displacing indigenous peoples and consolidating control over vast territories. Horses were at the center of all of this. The U.S. cavalry needed mounts. Most cavalry horses were bred in the East and raised on grain. They were used to abundant water. They were often bred from racing stock that prioritized speed over durability. When these horses encountered the Western environment, they failed. Army reports from the 1860s and 1870s consistently noted that cavalry mounts could not keep up with Indian ponies. The Mustangs and Appaloosas, ridden by indigenous warriors, were grass-fed, had far better endurance, and could operate in terrain that exhausted eastern horses. The military recognized this disparity, but had no immediate solution. Logistics made it difficult to source horses locally in the quantities needed. The breeding infrastructure did not exist to supply the army with Western-adapted animals on the scale required. So cavalry units continued riding horses that were fundamentally unsuited to the work, and they paid the price in military effectiveness. The cattle drives demonstrated the economic value of speed and endurance in a different way. A drive from Texas to Kansas might cover 1,000 miles over 3 to 4 months. The herds numbered in the thousands of cattle. A crew of 10 to 15 cowboys managed the herd, and each cowboy needed a string of 6 to 10 horses in the remuda because no single animal could work every day. The work was relentless, keeping the cattle moving, preventing stampedes, crossing rivers, navigating around settlements, dealing with rustlers and predators. The horses bore the brunt of it. A good horse could be ridden hard for a few hours, then spelled while the cowboy switched to a fresh mount. The best horses could be worked twice in one day if necessary. The worst horses broke down, went lame, and had to be left behind or shot. The drives created a market for thousands of horses annually, and the market selected ruthlessly for animals that could survive the work. Quarter horses with steel. Dust blood became the preferred mounts because they combined sprint speed for cattle work with enough durability to last the drive. Mustangs filled out the remudas as utility animals. The combination worked. The drive succeeded. Millions of cattle reached northern markets. The cowboys who made the drives became cultural icons, and the horses they rode became part of that iconography. The economics of horse. Breeding began to shift as the market matured. Early breeders like Steel Dust's owners had operated informally, keeping records if they kept them at all in personal ledgers, trading on reputation. By the 1880s and 1890s, ranchers recognized the need for more formal systems. Pedigrees mattered. A horse with documented breeding commanded higher prices than one with unknown ancestry. The problem was that no official registry existed. Bloodlines were tracked through word of mouth and informal networks. This worked for small operations but broke down at scale. Several attempts were made to create registries for what was being called the quarter horse or the Steel Dust breed. None succeeded in gaining widespread adoption during the 19th century. The situation was complicated by the fact that the most successful breeders were practical ranchers who cared more about producing useful animals than about paperwork. As long as a horse could do the work and win races on the weekend, its precise ancestry mattered less than its performance. But this lack of formal structure meant that the breed was not protected or standardized. Crossbreeding with thoroughbreds continued, introducing speed but sometimes diluting the compact musculature and cow sense that defined the type. Meanwhile, the Mustang population faced increasing pressure. As rangelands were fenced and settled, the space available for feral herds shrank. Ranchers saw wild horses as competition for grass that could feed cattle. Organized roundups captured thousands of animals. Some were broken and sold. Many were slaughtered. The perception of Mustangs shifted from valuable resource to pest. By the early 1900s, the population had declined dramatically from the millions estimated in the 1800s to perhaps a few 100,000. The animals that remained were increasingly confined to marginal lands, areas too rough or remote for agricultural use. The genetic diversity that had been one of the Mustang's strengths became endangered as herds were isolated from each other, and inbreeding increased. Some pockets of Mustangs retained characteristics of the original Spanish stock, but most herds by 1930 showed signs of mixing with domestic breeds, diluting the traits that had made them valuable in the first place. The Appaloosa faced an even more catastrophic threat, not from environmental pressure, but from deliberate military action. The Nez Perce had maintained their independence longer than most tribes, protected by treaties that recognized their land rights. But pressure from white settlers and gold miners eroded those protections. In 1863, a new treaty reduced Nez Perce territory by 90%. Several bands, including one led by a leader known as Hainmot Tuyalakit, or Chief Joseph, refused to accept the new treaty. They continued living on their traditional lands in the Wallowa Valley. By 1877, federal patience had run out. General Oliver Otis Howard, a Civil War veteran and devout Christian who believed he had been divinely selected to uplift Native Americans, was ordered to move the non-treaty bands onto the reservation. Howard set an impossible deadline: 30 days to vacate the Wallowa Valley and report to the reservation. To avoid war, most of the non-treaty bands complied. Around 600 Nez Perce, including Chief Joseph's band, gathered on the Camas Prairie in mid-June 1877. They had with them their families, the elderly, children, and their only significant wealth, approximately 2,000 horses. The situation exploded into violence on June 15th. Young warriors from the tribe attacked and killed several white settlers in retaliation for earlier grievances. The U.S. Army responded immediately. On June 17th, troops from Fort Lapwai engaged the Nez Perce at Whitebird Canyon in what was supposed to be a quick, punitive action. Instead, 70 Nez Perce warriors inflicted a devastating defeat on the army, killing 34 soldiers while losing none of their own, with only 4 wounded. The battle sparked what became a fighting retreat across 1,170 miles. One of the most remarkable military campaigns in American history. The Nez Perce were pursued by elements of the U.S. Army through Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. They fought 18 battles and skirmishes. They won all but the last, and they did it while protecting 800 non-combatants and managing a herd of 2,000 horses, plus hundreds of dogs and other livestock. The column stretched for miles. Their movement through difficult terrain was made possible by superior horsemanship and superior horses. The Appaloosas carried them. The military pursuit demonstrated graphically the difference between Eastern cavalry horses and Indian ponies. The army horses were larger, grain-fed, bred for short bursts of speed on flat ground. The Appaloosas were smaller, grass-fed, bred for mountain work and endurance. The Nez Perce warriors used their knowledge of terrain and their horses' capabilities to conduct hit-and-run attacks that devastated pursuing units. They would engage, inflict casualties, and disappear before the cavalry could organize an effective response. The speed of the Appaloosas allowed this tactic to work. On July 11th and 12th, the army caught up to the Nez Perce at the Clearwater River and attacked their camp. After 2 days of intense fighting, the Nez Perce were able to disengage and escape toward Montana, bringing their entire party and their horse herd with them. On July 16th, the main body departed Whitebird Prairie and began crossing the Lolo Trail, 120 miles of mountainous wilderness. They were 750 people, 2,000 horses, and hundreds of dogs moving through terrain that should have been impassable for a large group. They completed the crossing in 9 days and emerged on the Montana side on July 25th. The pursuit continued through the summer. The Nez Perce tried to find allies among other tribes. The Salish refused to help. The Crow, traditional friends, also declined. The band sought refuge with Sitting Bull's Lakota in Canada. They pushed north toward the border. On August 9th, the Nez Perce were attacked at Big Hole River while resting. The assault, led by Colonel John Gibbon, killed dozens of women and children. The band fought back, inflicted heavy casualties on the army, and escaped once more. By early October, they were exhausted. The relentless pursuit had worn them down. Starvation and exposure had killed many. The warriors had fought for months with almost no rest. On October 5, 1877, at the western edge of the Bear Paw Mountains in north-central Montana, the Army caught them. After 6 days under siege, with 250 Nez Perce warriors holding off 600 cavalry and infantry soldiers, Chief Joseph surrendered 184 women, 147 children, and 87 men. They were 40 miles from the Canadian border, 1,500 miles from home. Old Chief Whitebird refused to surrender and slipped through enemy lines with a small group, reaching Canada and joining Sitting Bull's camp. The aftermath was devastating. The captured Nez Perce were taken as prisoners of war to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. More than 20 died during the first winter. The survivors were eventually moved to a reservation in Oklahoma. They were not allowed to return to their homeland for years. The horse herds that had been their wealth and their military advantage were confiscated. The Army and white settlers took the best animals. Many were slaughtered deliberately to break the tribe's spirit and prevent any future resistance. The Appaloosa breed, which had been refined over more than a century by the Nez Perce breeding program, came close to extinction. A few horses escaped with Chief Whitebird to Canada. Some were hidden by sympathetic white settlers. The rest were scattered, their bloodlines diluted through crossbreeding with draft horses and other stock. The deliberate destruction of the Nez Perce horse herds was an act of cultural genocide, aimed not just at removing military capacity, but at erasing the tribe's identity and economic foundation. The question of speed in the context of the Nez Perce War is not about top velocity alone. The Appaloosas did not have to be the absolute fastest horses over a quarter mile. They had to be fast enough to avoid capture, durable enough to carry riders and packs over 1,100 miles of brutal terrain, intelligent enough to navigate mountain passes, and hardy enough to survive on whatever forage was available. They met all those requirements. The fact that the Nez Perce evaded the Army for months while protecting non-combatants and a massive horse herd demonstrates the quality of both the horses and the horsemanship. No other military force in the American West accomplished anything comparable. The U.S. cavalry, despite superior numbers and equipment, could not run down a group of refugees encumbered by women, children, and animals. The primary reason was the horses. Appaloosas, bred for generations to perform in exactly the kind of terrain and conditions the Nez Perce were fighting through, had an insurmountable advantage over grain-fed cavalry mounts bred in Kentucky and Pennsylvania. The genetic basis for speed in horses has been studied extensively in modern times, and the findings illuminate what 19th century breeders were selecting for without understanding the underlying biology. Speed in horses depends on several factors. Muscle fiber composition, with fast twitch fibers enabling rapid acceleration. Skeletal structure, particularly the length of the leg bones and the angle of joints, which determines stride, length, and efficiency. Cardiovascular capacity, the ability of the heart and lungs to deliver oxygen to muscles during exertion. Neurological coordination, the brain's ability to control complex movement patterns at high speed. And temperament, the psychological willingness to exert maximum effort. Breeders like the owners of Steel Dust or the Nez Perce horse, managers could not measure these traits directly, but they could observe their effects. A horse that accelerated quickly had a higher proportion of fast-twitch muscle fibers. A horse that maintained speed over distance had efficient cardiovascular function. A horse that performed consistently had the right temperament. Selective breeding amplified these traits generation by generation. The American quarter horse achieved its sprint speed through a specific body plan. Short back, heavily muscled hindquarters. Compact build. These characteristics concentrated power in the parts of the body responsible for acceleration. When a quarter horse burst from a standing start, the physics involved enormous force generated by the haunches and transmitted through the legs to the ground. The breed could reach top speed, sometimes 44 miles per hour, within the first few strides. This explosive acceleration was what made them dominant in quarter-mile racing, but it came at a cost. the same build that enabled sprint speed-limited endurance. Quarter horses could not maintain top speed for long distances. Their muscle fiber composition favored power over stamina. This was not a flaw. It was an adaptive trait for the work they were bred to do. Cutting a cow out of a herd required a short burst of speed, not sustained galloping. Mustangs achieved their endurance through different adaptations. Their feral existence imposed natural selection for efficiency. Horses that could survive on sparse forage, travel long distances between water sources, and evade predators were the ones that reproduced. Over generations, this winnowed the population toward animals with efficient metabolism, strong cardiovascular systems, and sound skeletal structure. Mustangs were lighter boned than quarter horses, which reduced the energy cost of movement. They had smaller, harder hooves that could handle rocky terrain. Their muscle fiber composition favored endurance over explosive power. They could maintain a steady pace for hours, covering 40 or 50 miles in a day without breaking down. This made them invaluable for long-distance travel and sustained work. The trade-off was slower acceleration. A Mustang could not match a quarter horse in a sprint, but over 10 miles, the Mustang would win decisively. The Appaloosa represented a compromise between these extremes, bred for versatility rather than specialization. The Nez Perce needed horses that could sprint when necessary, as in warfare or hunting. But they also needed horses that could carry loads through mountains, travel long distances, and work day after day. The breeding program selected for animals that had enough fast-twitch muscle for acceleration, enough slow-twitch muscle for endurance, skeletal structure that balanced strength and efficiency, and temperament that combined responsiveness with trainability. The result was a horse that could perform adequately in multiple roles rather than excelling in one. This versatility was exactly what the Nez Perce environment demanded. The spotted coat, the mottled skin, the striped hooves, these were side effects of the genetic selection for performance traits. The genes that controlled coat color happened to be linked to other genes that affected metabolism and muscle development. Breeders did not understand this connection, but they observed that spotted horses often had the traits they wanted, so they selected for the spots as a marker. The myth of the Wild West has tended to flatten out these distinctions, portraying horses as generic animals differentiated mainly by color. The reality was far more complex. Different breeds served different purposes. A rancher needed multiple types of horses for different tasks. A fast sprint horse for cattle work, an endurance horse for long rides, a sturdy pack horse for carrying supplies. The fastest horses, whether quarter horses or Mustangs or Appaloosas, were fastest in specific contexts. Understanding those contexts is essential to understanding how the West actually worked, rather than how it has been romanticized. The horses were not background props. They were technology, the most important technology available for transportation, work, and military purposes. The breeds that emerged from the 19th century were products of intense selective pressure, both human and natural, operating across decades in an environment that punished failure with death or irrelevance. By the early 20th century, the Wild West era was ending. Railroads had replaced cattle drives. Barbed wire had fenced the open range. Automobiles were beginning to appear. The demand for horses in general was declining, but certain types of horses remained valuable. Quarter horses continued to be used on ranches because they were still the best animals for working cattle. Mustang populations were collapsing as wild lands were converted to agriculture and ranching. The Appaloosa had nearly disappeared, its breeding program shattered by the Nez Perce War, and its surviving animals scattered and diluted. The need to preserve these breeds became apparent to a small number of enthusiasts who recognized that something important was being lost. In 1940, a group of ranchers and horsemen gathered in Fort Worth, Texas, to address the problem of preserving the quarter horse as a distinct breed. Robert Denhart, who had been researching steel dust horses and writing articles about the breed's history, organized the meeting. On March 15, 1940, 75 people met at the Fort Worth Club and discussed proposals for a breed registry. Denhart presented a charter modeled after the National Horse and Mule Association. The group voted to form the American Quarter Horse Association, a non-profit organization dedicated to collecting, recording, and preserving the pedigrees of quarter horses. The officers elected were W.B. Warren as president, Jack Hutchins as first vice president, Lee Underwood as second vice president, Jim Hall as treasurer, and Bob Denhart as secretary. The bylaws established registration requirements based on conformation, pedigree, and performance in shows and races. The founders decided to incentivize participation by offering registration number P1, signifying permanent registry, to the Grand Champion Stallion at the 1941 Southwestern Exposition and Fat Stock Show in Fort Worth. The winner was a horse named Wimpy, bred by the King Ranch. Wimpy was foaled April 3, 1937. He was sired by Solis and out of Panda, both get of Old Sorrel, making Wimpy as closely related to Old Sorrel as a son. Old Sorrel was the foundation sire of the King Ranch's quarter horse program, bred by George Clegg, who had sold him as a suckling colt for $125. Wimpy's registration as P1 established him as the symbolic first horse of the new registry, though obviously thousands of horses with quarter horse breeding already existed. After winning the Fort Worth show, Wimpy returned to the King Ranch, where he stood at stud until his death at age 22. He sired 174 registered foals. His bloodline continues to appear in quarter horse pedigrees today. The formation of AQHA created an institutional structure for the breed. Pedigrees were recorded systematically. Breeding could be tracked across generations. Conformation standards were established and enforced. The registry grew rapidly. Within a few years, thousands of horses were registered. By the late 1940s, AQHA had moved its headquarters to Amarillo, Texas, where it remains. The organization eventually became the largest equine breed association in the world, with more than 3 million horses registered. The quarter horse became the most popular breed in the United States, used not just for ranch work and racing, but for rodeo, showing, recreational riding, and numerous other purposes. The speed that had been the breed's defining characteristic in the 19th century remained important in certain contexts, particularly racing. But the breed's versatility, its cow sense, its trainability, these traits became equally valuable in the 20th century. The Mustang had a different trajectory. By 1934, J. Frank Dobie reported only a few wild horses remaining in Nevada, Wyoming, and other western states, with only a trace of Spanish blood in most of them. The vast herds of the 19th century had been reduced to pockets confined to the most marginal lands. In 1959, National Velvet author Velma Johnston, nicknamed Wild Horse Annie, began lobbying for federal protections for wild horses. Her campaign lasted 20 years. Finally, in 1971, Congress passed the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, which stated that wild horses and burros are living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West and should be protected from capture, branding, harassment, or death. The law designated them as integral parts of the natural system of public lands. Enforcement has been inconsistent, and debates over wild horse management continue today, but the Mustang population has stabilized at levels sufficient to ensure the breed's survival. The Bureau of Land Management oversees herds and implements adoption programs. As of recent counts, around 50,000 wild horses roam western states, primarily Nevada, Wyoming, and Montana. The Appaloosa's recovery began in 1938, when a group of breed enthusiasts formed the Appaloosa Horse Club to preserve the spotted horses and regain the refinement they had shown under Nez Perce breeding programs. The club collected breeding stock descended from horses that had survived the devastation of 1877. They established standards based on historical descriptions and photographs of Nez Perce horses. The registry grew slowly at first, constrained by the small number of foundation animals available. But by the late 20th century, the Appaloosa was secure. In the 1990s, the Nez Perce tribe itself initiated a breeding program, crossing old-line Appaloosas from the Wallowa herd with Acalteque horses from Central Asia to create a new breed called the Nez Perce horse. The Acalteque is legendary for endurance, and the cross was designed to recapture traits that the original Nez Perce breeding program had prioritized. The modern Nez Perce horse is typically buckskin or palomino, with Appaloosa characteristics like mottled skin and spotting. The breed is leaner and longer-backed than modern Appaloosas that have been crossed with quarter horses, resembling more closely the horses described in historical accounts of the Nez Perce War. The legacy of the fastest horses of the Wild West extends beyond the breeds themselves to the broader culture. The image of the cowboy on horseback remains one of the most powerful symbols of American identity. That image is inseparable from specific types of horses: the compact, muscular quarter horse, the hardy Mustang, the distinctive Appaloosa. These animals were not generic. They were products of particular historical circumstances, bred and selected for specific purposes. Their speed, whether measured in acceleration or endurance, was a response to the demands of frontier life. The romanticized version of the West often obscures the practical realities. Ranching was a business, brutally competitive and economically marginal for most participants. Horses were capital assets, valued in dollars and cents. A fast horse represented competitive advantage. It could move cattle more efficiently, win races that brought prize money and gambling profits, cover more ground with less rest, outrun hostile forces. The breeds that emerged from the 19th century West were optimized for these functions through generations of selection, both deliberate and natural. The fastest horses were those that survived and reproduced in an environment that rewarded speed. The American quarter horse achieved its velocity through human breeding programs that spanned 2 centuries, selecting for explosive acceleration in a compact, powerful frame. The Mustang achieved its endurance through natural selection operating on feral populations across millions of acres of harsh terrain. The Appaloosa achieved its balanced capabilities through the sophisticated breeding program of the Nez Perce, selecting for versatility and mountain performance. None of these horses was fastest in every context, but each was fastest in its domain. The quarter horse at the sprint, the Mustang at the marathon, the Appaloosa in the mountains. Together, they represented the cutting edge of equine performance in 19th century North America. Their descendants continue to dominate Western riding disciplines today because the traits selected for in the 1800s remain relevant. The AQHA registry maintains pedigrees for more than 3 million animals. The Mustang herds on public lands number in the tens of thousands. The Appaloosa is secure with its own registry and devoted following. These breeds are living links to the Wild West era, not as myth but as documented biological reality. Return to McKinney, Texas. Spring of 1855. The race is over. Steel Dust has won. Monmouth's owner counts out his losses. The crowd disperses slowly, digesting what they have witnessed. In 22 seconds, perhaps less, a hierarchy has been established. Steel Dust is fastest. His bloodline will spread. His name will become synonymous with a type. 59 years later, in 1941, a stallion named Wimpy will stand in a show ring in Fort Worth and be designated P1 in the American Quarter Horse Association's first stud book, the symbolic culmination of everything Steel Dust represented. The line from that race day to the modern quarter horse is direct and documentable. The traits that made Steel Dust fast in 1855 are the same traits that make quarter horses fast today. The 440 yards he covered in explosive seconds remained the distance at which the breed excels. Speed was never just speed. It was survival. It was wealth. It was the difference between prosperity and failure on a frontier where horses were the most important technology available, and the fastest horses held advantages that compounded across generations. The Wild West produced its own breeds, adapted to its own demands, and those breeds persist because the selection pressures that created them produced animals of exceptional quality. This is not legend. This is the record, found in stud books and race times and military reports and the careful observations of breeders who understood that speed mattered and who dedicated their lives to producing animals that possessed it in the highest degree achievable through the science of selective breeding as it was practiced in an era before genetics were understood, but after the principles of heredity had been proven in practice across thousands of horses, born, tested, and either preserved or culled based on their capacity to move faster than anything else across the most contested quarter miles in American history.